Welcome to Midlife a la Bahari. If your life looks successful on paper but feels different on the inside, you're in the right place. Here, we explore identity, clarity, fulfillment, and how to live more truthfully inside the life you've built. Follow the show to stay connected to the conversation. Hello and welcome back to Midlife a la Bahari. I am your host Bahari and I'm glad you're here. Before we begin, just take a moment to settle. You don't need to figure anything out as you listen to this episode. Just notice what lands. Notice what feels right and what feels true. I think a lot of high-achieving people imagine that if they were really disconnected from themselves, they would know it in some dramatic way. Something would fall apart. They would hit a wall. Or there would be some obvious crisis they could point to and say, "There, that's the problem." But very often, that is not what happens. Very often, people do not lose themselves dramatically. They lose themselves by adapting. They get very good at doing what is needed, very good at being reliable, very good at staying composed, and very good at carrying a lot without making much noise about it. And over time, they can build a life that looks completely fine from the outside while privately feeling less and less like themselves inside it. And that is what I want to talk to you about today. Because I think this is one of the most quietly painful experiences in midlife. Not collapse, not visible crisis, something quieter than that. A life can still be working and still stop feeling like it belongs to you. And when that happens, the issue is not always exhaustion in the obvious sense. Often, it becomes misalignment masked by competence. One of the reasons this is so hard to name is that capable people are often incredibly good at functioning through things. You know how to keep going. You know how to meet expectations. You know how to take care of what is in front of you. You know how to stay steady. And you know how to deliver even when something deeper feels off. So because they are still functioning, they often assume the problem cannot be that significant. And I want to say this very clearly today. Functioning is not the same thing as feeling connected. And competence is definitely not the same thing as inner agreement. You can be very, very capable and still be living in a way that no longer feels true. That is part of what makes this pattern so tricky. Nothing necessarily looks broken. In fact, a lot of it may still look quite good. Your life may look stable. You may be respected. You may be doing well by most measures. You may have built something solid. There may be a lot in your life that other people would point to and say, "But this is really good. You have a really good life." And maybe it is all good. But that doesn't automatically mean it still fits. That doesn't automatically mean it still feels like yours. I think this is where a lot of high-achieving people get confused. Because what often gets rewarded in life, things like reliability, usefulness, endurance, self-control, composure, high standards, can slowly become an identity. You stop thinking of those qualities as things you do. They become who you are. I'm the one who handles things. I'm the one people can count on. I'm the one who keeps going. I'm the one who can carry more than most. I'm the one who does not fall apart. And to be clear, those qualities are not the problem. Capability is not a problem. Ambition is not a problem. Responsibility and discipline are not problems. The problem starts when your ability to function becomes the main way you measure whether your life is okay. When being effective becomes your proof that nothing deeper needs your attention. When competence becomes the thing that helps you keep going, but also prevents you from noticing what the cost of that way of living actually is. Because that cost is often subtle at first. It may show up as emotional flatness, not deep misery, just a kind of thinning. A sense that you're doing everything you're supposed to do, but you're no longer deeply in contact with yourself while you do it. Sometimes it shows up as resentment, not always as loud resentment, sometimes very quiet resentment. You're doing what needs to be done. You're taking care of things. You're showing up. You're being responsible. But there is an internal friction building underneath all of that. Sometimes it shows up as disconnection from desire. You can still make decisions. You can still handle your life. But if someone asks you what you really want to do, the answer feels strangely far away from what you're doing. And sometimes it just feels like maintenance. Everything is being managed, everything is being carried, and everything is being kept in motion. But very little feels fully alive. That is why I often say high-achieving people do not usually lose themselves through collapse. They lose themselves through successful adaptation because they're great adapters. That phrase matters, my friends, because the adaptation really is successful in one sense. It keeps life going. It produces results. It keeps things stable. It protects identity, and it allows the person to remain highly functional. But internally, it can also create distance. Distance from truth, from grief, from desire, from values, and distance from the quiet inner knowledge that something no longer fits the way it used to. And once that distance becomes normal, something important happens. The outside keeps working, and the inside gets harder to hear. That is when the pattern becomes self-reinforcing. Because when something feels off, most high-functioning people do not automatically stop and listen. Usually, they become more effective. They do more. They tighten things up. They get organized even more. They become even more useful. They improve the system. They raise the standard. And they keep on going and going and going. And of course, that creates some relief because motion feels reassuring. Competence feels familiar. And if being effective has always been one of the ways you steady yourself, then it makes sense that you would reach for it again and again. But relief is not the same as resolution. That is the part that matters. After a while, the achievement settles. It becomes the new normal. The next demand shows up, and the internal flatness or unease comes back. So the person responds the same way again and again. That is the loop. Something feels off, you become more effective. You feel temporary relief, then the emptiness returns, and you answer it with more performance. That loop is incredibly common in high-functioning people, and it is one of the reasons someone can look successful for a very long time while privately feeling more and more disconnected. That is also part of why midlife can feel so exposing. Not necessarily because midlife creates the problem. Often, it just becomes harder to keep misnaming it. What used to feel motivating starts to feel heavy. What used to feel clear starts to feel thin. What used to feel worth the cost no longer feels worth it in the same way. And that can be deeply disorienting if a lot of your identity has been built around being the person who can make things work. Then the real question is no longer just, can I handle this? You probably can. The real question becomes, does this still feel true? Does this still feel like mine? Does this way of living still deserve my loyalty? Those are very different questions. And they ask for a different kind of maturity. Not more control, not more effort, not more proving, more honesty. I also think this is where one idea from psychology is useful. Human beings do not thrive on competence alone. Competence matters, don't get me wrong. Of course, it matters. But so do autonomy and real connection. And many high-achieving adults are deeply developed in competence. They know how to achieve, deliver, and function. But they may be undernourished in those other dimensions. Not necessarily because something is wrong with them, but because competence is the part of them that has been most rewarded. So they keep trying to solve a deeper human problem with the tool they trust most, performance. And performance can do a lot, but it cannot tell you whether your life still fits. It cannot tell you whether your standards are still yours. It cannot tell you whether you are still living in a way that feels internally honest. That is why this conversation matters, because sometimes the issue is not that you need to become stronger. Sometimes the issue is that you need to stop using strength to avoid what you already know. Let me bring this a little closer, because this only becomes useful if you can recognize the pattern in your own life. I want to offer you a few questions here, and I don't mean them as vague reflection prompts. I mean them more as a way to diagnose what may actually be happening underneath the surface for you in your life. So take whichever one lands most strongly. The first question is, where in my life am I still very effective, but no longer genuinely nourished? This is not about where you're failing. It is about where you're still doing well, but something important in you is no longer being fed by the way you are living there. Question number 2. What am I continuing because it fits my identity, my competence, or other people's expectations, not because it still feels deeply chosen? This is an important distinction. A lot of people keep things in place not because they are still true, but because they are familiar, or admired, or consistent with who they have been for a very long time. Third question. Where have I mistaken external smoothness for internal rightness? Just because something is functioning well does not mean it is right for you in the current form. Number 4. What feeling have I been too functional to fully admit? Resentment, grief, loneliness, dread, emptiness, a quiet sense of being absent from your own life? Fifth and final question. If I stopped proving for a moment and started listening, what truth would become harder to avoid? I think this question matters a lot because high-achieving people often know more than they let themselves know. The problem is not always awareness. Often it is permission. Permission to take what they know seriously. Permission to stop minimizing every emotional signal. Permission to stop turning inner discomfort into a performance issue. And here is something I really want you to notice. When something feels off, what is your first reflex? Do you become more efficient? Do you make a tighter plan? Do you become more useful? Do you push the feeling aside and focus on output? Do you tell yourself to be grateful and move on? Or do you make the discomfort smaller by becoming even more capable? That reflex matters. Because very often, it is not just a habit. It is part of the loop. It is the move that stops the signal from becoming language. And when that happens often enough, Person can live in a near constant state of self-override while still looking extremely composed from the outside. Here is the uncomfortable truth I want to offer you. A life can be successful enough to impress other people and still be built around too much self-abandonment. That doesn't mean your whole life is false. It doesn't mean that everything has to change. It does not mean that you were wrong to be strong, responsible, or ambitious. It simply means there may be places where your strength has been covering for a deeper absence. And if you do not take the time to examine that honestly, you can stay loyal for a very long time to ways of living that are no longer worthy of that loyalty. Not because you consciously chose that, but because you became too practiced at coping to interpret it. That is why better pattern recognition matters. Once you can name the pattern, you stop misreading your life. You stop calling misalignment stress. You stop calling self-abandonment discipline. You stop calling emotional flatness adulthood. You stop calling overfunctioning personality. And that shift from vague discomfort to more accurate naming is often where something most honest begins. Let's make this practical. I want to leave you with one exercise and one standard to test. This exercise is simple. Choose one area of your life that you have been maintaining quite well. Not the most chaotic area, the one that looks relatively fine. Then divide the page into 3 parts. Column 1, what still looks fine. Column 2, what feels off. Column 3, what I have been compensating for with competence. Under what still looks fine, write the external facts. Under what feels off, write your inner truth. And under what I have been compensating for with competence, write how you have been managing the gap. Maybe by over-preparing, maybe by staying useful, maybe by suppressing what you feel, maybe by becoming even more dependable, maybe by refusing to slow down long enough to hear what you already know. Then finish the sentence. The truth I have been overriding here is ... That is the exercise. No fixing, no dramatic decisions, just a more honest contact with reality. And here is the standard I want you to test this week. I will not use productivity as proof that something is okay. When friction appears, pause before you convert it into output. Pause and ask yourself, is this a capacity issue or is this a truth issue? This question alone can interrupt a lot because not every problem needs more effort. Some problems need more honesty. And that is where I want to leave this today. There are people who do not need more encouragement. They don't need more inspiration. They don't need bigger goals. They don't need another polished language for their inner life. They simply need more accurate words. They need a way to understand why they are still functioning and still not fully there. They need a way to recognize that a life can work and still require a more truthful relationship to it. That is the work I want to do more clearly here, my friends. Not just reflection, but better pattern recognition. Not fewer human questions, but more honest naming of what the real problem is. If your life works, but no longer fully feels like yours, you're in the right place. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next episode. Peace out. This podcast reflects my own views and is provided for general information, education, and entertainment purposes only. It is not professional advice of any kind. Please seek qualified professional support for your specific situation.